Okay, so in our third chapter, we focus on the message. I think at the end of the chapter 2, I already alluded a little bit to that, that obviously it matters what the message is, right? And it matters what kind of content the message has and how crazy it is, right? I think I said at the end of the chapter 2, I said, well, if you're trying to convince me that the earth is flat, I think no persuasive appeal will do that. But let's say there's something that is somewhat reasonable, something where you and I could be convinced of. And now what research is doing is kind of looking at, how could we frame something? How could we make the right appeal? The content is similar, but how can we frame the message in a way that makes it more persuasive or less persuasive? So this is a little bit like where, again, we kind of look at the central and peripheral route, okay? So here we are sometimes trying to say that, okay, it would be great if we could activate with our message the central route, or if we could activate the peripheral route. Right? And it's like, okay, what is more, what is basically better and more persuasive? So in the first part of on chapter 1, I talked about this kind of encounter here between Dr. Carson and Donald Trump, and they talk about vaccinations, right? And I think here you can see that, or if you can remember that, Dr. Carson really kind of appeals to the central route. He says like, well, there's all this evidence. And then on the other hand, Donald Trump kind of, there's all this evidence, that autism is not related to vaccinations, and there are these studies, and you can look at them, and they're well argued, and science and all of that, right? So here he's trying to kind of go via the central route and saying like people should be convinced by the evidence, by the quality of the argument. And Donald Trump basically takes the complete different approach. He scares people, right? He makes it really vivid. He's just like, oh, I just like, there was this beautiful little baby girl, and they went to the doctor and they took the syringe, and the syringe was like as big as you would normally think it's for a horse, and they ram it into her arm, and the baby cries, and 2 days later the baby has this fever, and then a month later they have autism, right? So he says like, I don't know about the research, but this is what I know, and autism is an epidemic and we have to do something about it. So he really tries to scare parents. So the question is here, what is more likely to be influential, right? Does fear actually work well in persuading people? So this is something that we kind of, like me and Tali Sharot, Tali Sharot developed a paradigm that I'm about to show you, that we looked into it, okay? And so imagine that you would come into my study and I would ask you a question like that, and I would ask you 50 to 80 more questions like this. But I would ask you something like, how likely do you think it is that you will get cancer in your lifetime? A somewhat threatening question, right? It's not nice to contemplate the chances or the likelihood of getting cancer. So let's say you think like, I don't know, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 40%, maybe it's 60%. Put an estimate in there. Think of a number for yourself. What do you think is the likelihood that you will get cancer once in your lifetime? And now, as next, after participants put in the first estimate, we show them the actual statistics of happening on average. So this is a statistic taken from the Office of National Statistics in the UK, and they estimate that for people at your age, for students, it's or for young people at your age, it's about 53% that you will have some kind of cancer, whether it's a really aggressive one or a really benign one in your life, is 53%. Okay, and then what we do in our studies is like, okay, now how likely do you think it is now that you will get cancer in your lifetime? And you can put in a second estimate. So what we can see here in this paradigm, that we first ask you about the cancer, then we have a first estimate. Let's say you put in 70%, you're really pessimistic, you think like, oh my God, it's almost sure that I will get cancer. Then you kind of learn it's 53%. We call this, and it's a term that Tali Sharot coined, we call this good news, okay? So here you basically learn that a horrible event like cancer is less likely to happen to you than you previously thought. And now we kind of see what you do thereafter, how much you change your mind. The second estimate, maybe you say 59% now. So we can, again, as in the first chapter, we can measure how much you update your belief in response to good news. But what happens if you thought 40%? If you thought less? Now you get threatening information. Now you get bad news, right? It's like, oh my God, it's higher. And now we can kind of look at how much you change your mind. So maybe you just go 41% because you think, oh, I don't know. So here it's basically, we can again measure the difference in between your first and your second estimate as give it a number, quantifying it, how much these bad news were taken into account. So what we do in our studies is we do this for kind of like 40 to 80 events. So you would see 40 to 80 negative life events, and sometimes you would get good news, sometimes you would get bad news. And here, this is the learning rate. This is just how influential. It's an estimate of how influential the type of news is. And here you can see we have on the left the good news and on the right the bad news. This is taken from a study that I did with Tali, but there are many, many, many other studies. Literally, I've done this task with literally thousands of people, and we always find somewhat the same result. And what we find is that basically good news are much more influential than bad news. People seem to be much more likely to change their mind or change their estimates after good news, after information they like to hear, than after bad news. And Tali in her research can show that basically what you can see is like that the brain is much more inclined to track the negative, the positive information. So once they see that this is kind of like positive, good news, the brain kind of actively tracks the information that is embedded in that good news, while for negative news there's a relatively meager tracking of information. There's a relative failure to track that information, and hence it seems like what Tali Sharot's and my research suggests is that the brain is not very interested in threatening or fearful information. So Tali is always saying that, I think she has a wonderful TED talk about this, if you want to influence people, then you should kind of go with positive news. You should try, if you want them to remember your message, if you want them, don't threaten them, but deliver good news. Research on that, like this is like a very early article that kind of supports that. This is about fear arousing communication, about dental hygiene, and they also thought that the more threatening the information is, the less likely people are inclined to actually change their dental cleaning routine. There's also some research that shows that basically, I think if you scare, for instance, smoker into if it's like, oh my God, you will get cancer, then people get stressed. People who smoke get stressed, and what do they do if they get stressed? They start smoking. But in other areas it seems to be much more effective. So there are some areas where basically the appeal to fear is quite effective. So in general, I think for communications, just like climate change, often the fear is an effective motivator to at least erase risk perceptions and intentions. Not actual, most of these studies, I think most of them never actually measure the actual behavior, but just kind of like the precursors of behavior such as attitudes or intentions to perform this behavior. So there's a bit of mixed of research. I think some people are really in favor of the kind of fear messages, but a lot of people who are involved in communicating like climate change information, but also other information, are looking to explore new avenues. So this is not the original, but this is a paper where they look at humor. So in this study, what they're trying to do is like they try to present in funny ways information about climate change. So they have the weatherman who kind of presents information about climate change in a funny way, and they can find that this is basically here now people take the information about climate change better in because they're somewhat, and this is the idea, somewhat distracted by the humor. However, a lot of people shy away from using humor, especially stupid humor like that, because they might fear that this decreases the source credibility, right? You can say if you kind of go in and you are the funny scientist, then maybe people are more willing to listening to you, but they might be less willing to invite you again or might see you as less credible. So humor might be one way to kind of frame your message. Another one that gains real popularity, especially with people who practice, who are in the field. So I have one student that I work with. She's a part-time master's student, and she works in an agency that tries to help NGOs and other charities to communicate risk effectively. And here they focus a lot about hope. Can we combine the threatening information with ways of how we can overcome that? So instead of purely threatening people, can you say, like, look, there's hope. If we change our behavior, then we can actually attack this, we can actually make a difference. So it seems like that often, and at least in these areas, it's perceived that hope is a better motivator than fear. So to kind of come back to that, let me just kind of go back to Trump last time. So I think Tali in her book on how to influence people, she describes this episode and she says, well, in this case, it might actually be a really good way, because what happens to us humans, to all animals, if they're threatened? What we do is we either freeze or we run away. So if you want people to not do something, then threats are pretty good to freeze us and to induce a flight. Very rarely humans or animals fight. Most of us, we freeze or we fly. So this is something where in specific context, threatening information might be really good, but this might sometimes be backfiring because people might just avoid the issue altogether because it becomes something anxiety or threat evoking. There's one last thing that I want to kind of mention that talks a little bit as an interesting effect. That's the so-called sleeper effect that connects the last chapter with this chapter, right? So let's say you get a message, and this message is the same message, but you get it either from a really untrustworthy source, or you get it from a trustworthy source, right? So what you can see is that what we learned in chapter 2 is that more credible sources are more persuasive. So if I know that a source, something comes from a really important source, then okay, or a credible source, a good newspaper, then I'm more likely to believe it. There's this interesting thing where basically in the sleeper effect, over time, we kind of forget about the source, but remember the message, okay? So this is an example of Pizzagate. You might not have heard of Pizzagate, but in the election between Trump and Hillary Clinton, there was this rumor going on that basically Hillary Clinton is involved in some kind of illegal sex trafficking ring that involves children. And this was all centered around this pizzeria here, hence the name Pizzagate. A pizzeria in Washington, D.C. And at one point, a person stormed into the pizzeria. He had a gun in his hand and he demanded to see the basement, because the idea was that in the basement, this is where it's all going down. This is where the children are held for the sex trafficking ring. Interestingly, the pizzeria didn't even have a basement, so that didn't pan out, and so it's often ridiculed. But the idea here is that you hear about this Pizzagate on some kind of crazy Reddit, 4chan, whatnot, internet source, and then maybe a month later you see it again. It's like, oh, you forgot where you heard of it. It's like, oh, I heard about this. Interesting. So now basically what the sleeper effect has is that uncredible sources can basically impact you in the long run by basically you forgetting the source but not forgetting the message. And so here, while credible sources, basically the influence decays over time, for uncredible sources, the sleeper effect shows that it increases over time. So it could be that basically putting rumors out there in the here and now, people do not believe these rumors, but a month or two later, they kind of lay the groundwork to then be persuaded by something as crazy as Pizzagate.